Hi, welcome to the Rambling Rector. Today we're going to talk about prayer. Now, that's a really big subject, so we're going to have to break it down into some little chunks for you to have a look at. So bear with me and let's have a look at the world of prayer. Now, obviously prayer is central to our understanding as people of faith. All people of faith pray in one way or another, and an awful lot of people who have no faith at all send some prayers from time to time to whoever they believe in. So, let's start with a little story from the Bible, the Old Testament, and the call of Samuel. Now you may recall that he heard voices in the middle of the night, and he went to see his old guardian Eli and said, "You called me? What would you like me to do?" And Eli said, "Go back to bed, go back to bed, there's nothing happening." This happened 3 times, and eventually Samuel twigged what might be going on. So he heard the voice again. And he spoke to the voice and said, "Speak, Lord, for I am listening." That's a really, really important thing for him to have said, because he didn't say, "Listen, Lord, for I am speaking." But so much of our prayer life is all about speaking into the space and expecting God to respond. So that's the first clue to what prayer really is. It's a dialogue. It's an opportunity for us to speak to God, but also for God to speak to us. And it's always polite, when somebody is speaking to you, to listen. So the first rule of good prayer is remember that it is a dialogue between you and God. Now that brings us on to perhaps the point of you watching this video today, which is how to lead intercessory prayer. Now, intercessory prayer is when you speak on behalf of a group of people, fellow worshippers, and you are speaking to God. You're speaking on their behalf. So the first rule applies there as much as anything. We need to make sure that when we speak, we leave space for God. It's a little bit like that old story, and perhaps some of you might remember when you went to dances as a young person, and the matron who was supervising things kept a very gimlet eye on everybody and said, "Don't forget to leave space for Jesus between you both." And that's really important, because we have to leave space for God to respond. Because although God may not be responding directly to us, there may be some sort of response amongst those for whom we are praying and with whom we are praying. So that's the first rule, leave space for God. The second rule is this: don't be nervous. Don't worry about the fact that you have been asked to pray on behalf of other people. Don't worry about whether you say the right things or the wrong things. Just make sure you keep a few things in the back of your mind. It's really good to have a structure. An easy threefold structure to bear in mind is probably something like the church, where we pray for the church throughout the world, perhaps of all denominations, perhaps of all people of faith. We then talk about the world, with all of its damage and its difficulties, and those who are in strife, and those who need intercessory prayer. We then might end with prayer for those who have died, for those who are kept on a distant shore and in a greater light, and I'm sure that you will find the words, and they are very important to include in our prayers. If you want to mix it up a bit, by all means add something topical. But here is a potential trap. We need to be very mindful of the fact that we are praying on behalf of others, and we need to therefore not put words into the mouths of those for whom we are offering prayer that they would not be comfortable saying. We also need to be mindful of not giving away too much information. So if we come to pray for the sick, it's best not to pray for somebody's piles or that weird rash that they've got, or other information which may have come to you but which may not necessarily be shared by others, and which those for whom we pray may not necessarily have it shared either. So we might generally pray for those in any kind of need, who suffer in body and mind and spirit, and whose needs are known to God. And that's a nice way of using a form of words which is very inclusive, which involves everyone, but which isn't talking about areas of specific medical need. When we're talking about those who die, don't forget those who mourn. Although we obviously pray for those who are kept on a distant shore and in a greater light, we pray also for those who are bereaved or who are worried about somebody who they know who may be dying. And again, not necessarily important to include people by name, but more general and generic terms are usually appropriate. You might find it helpful to use some newspapers, news services, to formulate your prayers in order to make them reasonably topical. But again, it's important not necessarily to take sides. If we were, for example, praying for war, we might want to pray for those friendly to our side, but we need also to remember that there are many people who fight in wars who would rather not be there, and they are as innocent as everyone. So we need to be fairly generous in our prayers. We need also to remind ourselves that God isn't necessarily on our personal side. It's probably inappropriate to say something like, we pray for God who obviously will support such and such cause, because it's obvious to me that God would want to support a cause that I believe in. That may very well be your view, but it's really important to remember that some other people for whom you are praying and who are with you may not necessarily see God on your side of the argument. Perhaps they might see God on their side. I would say, as a general rule, don't forget that God probably isn't going to take sides in those sorts of arguments, and perhaps it's not a great idea to invoke his name in order to gain your support. It's probably best to argue your case, and your argument will fall or stand on its merits. It's very useful, I find, when using intercessory prayer, to keep a formula in the back of your mind, and a prayer book that you will be using, and I'm assuming in the main that you will be Christian and possibly Anglican. There are plenty of resources within the Anglican Communion, or indeed within the Catholic Church, that give you the formula and the structure around which you should pray. It's actually quite important to maintain that structure as much as you can. That's really because of the principle of worship without surprises. Remember that it's important to guide people into a place of prayer, to enable them with you to pray to God. And so therefore it's important not to give them too many difficult things to remember. A favourite of mine is, from time to time you'll find people who will say the response to the prayer is, Lord, who is wonderful and almighty, keep us and hold us and love us. Now, by the time you've actually remembered that, when you're praying, you're actually going to rather lose track. And in fact, I just said that, I can't remember it. If you're going to use a formula, which I would suggest you do, to encapsulate your prayers, then use something like this. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Quite straightforward. Pretty generic. Most people know it. If you really want to mix it up a bit, you might say, Lord, who is the most generous, in your mercy, hear our prayer. There's that oral clue for those who are listening. You're using the same form of words. If you really, really need to go off-piste, then I would suggest you keep it simple and short. And when you begin your prayers, say something like, the response to the prayers will be, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Then you say, Lord, in your mercy, and the congregation will respond, hear our prayer. If you want to go, Lord of greatness and mercy, hear our prayer, then say, the response to Lord of greatness and mercy is, hear our prayer. Lord of greatness and mercy, hear our prayer. Very straightforward. It just gives people a bit of a clue, a bit of an insight, and it means that it's bedded into their brain to some extent, and you will be able to use that in your prayers. Right, well, that ends this video on intercessory prayer. There are more videos to watch, and I would encourage you to do so. And please feel free to ask me any questions down below. And I've also put some links in that will enable you to find some sources of prayer. I wish you well, and I pray that you intercede with confidence, competence, and with love and respect.